The silence has always been the loudest sound in my life. It's not the quiet peace of a deep forest or a sleeping house. No, it's the kind of silence that's thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from unsaid words and unseen hurts, an echo chamber where all my screams die before they ever reach the air, the silent echoes of my heart. I live now. I breathe. I even smile sometimes. But I am a building perpetually under construction, built on a foundation of betrayal and shame, forever waiting for the structural integrity to just give way and crumble into dust. This final love, this final unrequited ache, is just the latest, the most beautiful, and perhaps the most devastating chapter in a story that began in shadows, a story I've carried, heavy as a stone, from the moment I became Ragini. Life, they say, is unpredictable, a tapestry of joy and sorrow, of love and of a cruelty so sharp it leaves you breathless, and I have known them all. Some wounds, the shallow ones, they clot and fade with time, leaving behind a pale, silvery scar that you can almost forget. But the others, the deep, ragged gashes that tear through the very fabric of your soul, those don't heal. They don't fade. They simply reshape you, forging a new person out of the damaged pieces. They become a part of your bone, a whisper in your blood. This is my story, a desolate journey through heartbreak, a desperate fight for mere survival, and the stubborn, perhaps foolish, hope that one day I will know a love that doesn't cost me my soul. I come from a place called Sarayalore, a tiny, dusty village near Kanpur, the kind of place where everyone knows your name, but no one ever truly sees you. Our house, a modest structure of brick and cement, was always filled with a low, simmering tension. My mother, Sudha, a woman whose hands were rarely idled but whose heart seemed perpetually restless, was the center of this storm. She was a housewife, her days a relentless cycle of chores, her spirit worn thin by the ceaseless demands of a life she perhaps never truly chose. My father, Dinesh, was perpetually abroad, a phantom presence, whose financial contributions kept the house standing, but whose emotional absence created yawning voids we learned to navigate in silence. His image, a crisp, smiling photograph on the mantelpiece, was more real than the man himself, a man who was a provider, but never truly a protector. Then there was Sarika, my elder sister, the star. 7 years my senior, she was everything I was not. Outgoing, beautiful, and, most crushingly, academically brilliant. From the moment I could understand words, my life became a comparison, a constant, demoralizing echo of her success. Why can't you be more like Sarika? Why aren't your grades as good? Why are you so quiet, Ragini? Why? My mother's approval was a fragile, precious thing, reserved almost exclusively for my sister, while for me there was only the sharp edge of her short temper. She would scold me, her voice rising to a pitch that made my small frame tremble, and sometimes a sudden slap or a stinging blow would follow, often for reasons I couldn't even grasp, leaving me huddled in a corner, weeping into the rough cotton of my frock. Even now, years later, the feeling persists, a cold, undeniable certainty that my family, despite their protests, preferred the bright, dazzling light of Sarika to the quiet, dusty shadow that was me. But the strange, twisted logic of family is that despite the pain, despite the emotional neglect, despite the preference, I still loved them. I loved my mother, my father, my sister, my distant kind grandparents, a fierce, loyal love that was utterly, devastatingly unreciprocated in the way I needed it most. But before the sting of indifference, before the sharp words and the unfair comparisons, there was a deeper wound, one that settled into the quiet places of my soul and refused to leave. It was a memory from my childhood, a shard of glass in the soft lining of my heart, a trauma I never spoke of that still, to this day, colors the entire world in shades of fear and distrust. He was my cousin, a boy a few years older who lived close enough to be a fixture in our daily routine. He'd visit often, a seemingly harmless presence, who would join our games, his laughter blending with the afternoon sounds of the village. I must have been around 8, barely in the 3rd standard, a child preoccupied with the simple, bright chaos of childhood. He was in the 8th, already a teenager, a gap that suddenly felt like a chasm on that particular sun-drenched afternoon. My mother, Suda, had to rush out, a sudden emergency, a neighbor needing urgent help. I can't remember the exact reason, only the abruptness of her departure. She gave a quick instruction, her voice hurried, a casual command that sealed my fate. She told him, "Look after your little sister." I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was family. He was older. He was the person my mother had explicitly designated as my temporary keeper. The world felt normal. We played for a while, a board game, I think, and talked about school. A comfortable, benign interaction that gave no hint of the darkness waiting around the corner. Then came the shift. Subtle, insidious. He paused the game, his expression changing from casual ease to something older, something I couldn't recognize. "Come to the bedroom," he said, "just to show you something cool." My heart, a small, trusting bird, fluttered without fear. I followed him, willingly stepping across the threshold into the dim, quiet room where the light felt muted and the air felt suddenly heavy. I was completely oblivious, my mind still on the pieces of the game, on the innocent everyday exchange that had just taken place. Inside the small, sparsely furnished room, the air suddenly thickened with an unspoken terror. He didn't show me anything cool. Instead, he unzipped his pants, the harsh, grating sound of the metal zipper cutting through the unnatural silence of the afternoon. He stood there, his eyes fixed on me, and then he spoke the words that would replay in my mind for decades, a stuttering, terrified loop. "Touch it, Ragini." I was frozen. I didn't understand. My 8-year-old brain scrambled for a meaning that wasn't there, a context that wasn't possible. I knew instinctively that this was wrong, horribly, terribly wrong. But I was paralyzed by confusion more than fear, by the sheer bewildering violation of the moment. He didn't ask again. He simply grabbed my small, resistant hand, a powerful, older boy's grip, and forced it onto him. The sensation was alien, disgusting, terrifying. I wanted to scream, to pull away, but my body had betrayed me, locking me in a silent, rigid shock. Then, the final layer of the poison. "Don't tell anyone, Ragini. Not your mother, not your sister, no one. If you do, I'll tell everyone you did it first, that you asked me to." The fear, suddenly, was overwhelming, a cold flood of absolute terror. My breathing hitched, my eyes wide and hot with unshed tears. But then, a sound. The front door opening, a familiar, impatient click. It was my mother. Suda was back. The abrupt noise, the sudden return, shattered the moment like thin ice. He flinched, pulling away instantly, hastily zipping his pants, his face draining of color, replaced by a mask of quick, practiced nonchalance. Nothing more happened. The moment had passed, the potential horror cut short by mere seconds, by the unexpected, timely return of my unsuspecting mother. I stood there, silent, trembling, the secret a heavy, toxic knot already beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. I never told her. How could I? I was too afraid, too deeply terrified of his threat, of the possibility that she wouldn't believe me, that she would be angry at me, that somehow this nightmare would be twisted and blamed back onto my small, fragile shoulders. The silence became my cage. It was easier to live with the heavy weight of the secret than to risk the explosion of truth. He, of course, visits even now. He walks into our house, laughs with my father, speaks casually with my mother, acts with a chilling, effortless normality, as if that afternoon never existed, as if the terror he inflicted was merely a fleeting shadow he chose to forget. For him, it may be a buried memory, a teenage transgression he discarded years ago. But for me, it is the original trauma, the genesis of my isolation. The reason I learned so young that the world was a fundamentally unsafe place, that trust was a dangerous currency, and that the only true constant was my own solitary fear. I still wonder, late at night, in the dark and quiet of my room, what if my mother hadn't come back in time? What then? The question is a ghost that sits on the edge of my bed, its presence chilling me to the bone. The loneliness of my childhood did not end at home. School was a continuation, a relentless daily affirmation of my invisibility. I was shy, excruciatingly introverted, the girl who sat in the last row and hoped desperately that the teacher wouldn't call her name. I had no friends. My classmates, cruel as only children can be when they sense weakness, avoided me, whispered about me, and mocked my looks. They called me a mute wallflower, a shadow girl. It wasn't just my quiet demeanor. I wasn't good at my studies either. The struggle was real, a constant uphill battle that felt 10 times harder because I was forever stacked up against the mythical, flawless standard of my sister. Sarika's academic brilliance was a spotlight that blinded everyone to my own efforts, my small, hard-won victories. The comparison was the soundtrack of my life, a devastating chorus sung by my parents and amplified by the sneering looks of my peers. It hammered home the message day after day that I would never be enough, that my quiet existence was a failure, a disappointment, a pale imitation of the daughter they truly wanted. But the human heart is a resilient, stubborn organ. It seeks connection even in the most barren places. In the 9th standard, a small, fragile light appeared. Kritika. She saw the girl in the shadow. And for some reason I still can't fully comprehend, she reached out. We became close. Our friendship was a small, secret garden in the desolate landscape of my school life. It was a lifeline. But high school ended and life pulled us apart, leaving me once again adrift, searching for a handhold, a voice to banish the echoing silence. The true, seismic shift in my emotional life began in the 11th standard, in the cramped, airless room of my tuition class. It was there I found him. I will not use his name, because he doesn't deserve the weight of recognition in my narrative, only the cold, clinical label of the first betrayer. For the first time since Kritika, I felt seen, acknowledged, spoken to as an equal, a person of value. He was kind, or at least he seemed kind, his words weaving a gentle, persistent spell that dissolved the thick armor of my shyness. We started chatting, innocently at first, then with increasing frequency, often late into the night, a small, clandestine ritual performed with my mother's phone, a small act of rebellion that felt like enormous, dangerous freedom. At that time, he had a girlfriend. I knew it. I accepted the boundary, positioning myself as the platonic, reliable friend, the one he could confide in when the waters of his relationship grew choppy. He would tell me everything, the petty arguments, the misunderstandings, the slow, agonizing erosion of their bond. I listened, always. I comforted him, my heart aching with a complicated mix of genuine sympathy and a small, shameful spark of hope. I was his unwavering pillar, his sounding board, standing firmly by his side as the relationship finally crumbled into dust. And in the process, in the slow, intimate sharing of his pain, in the hours spent stitching his broken heart back together, my own heart, the one that had been silent and walled off for so long, betrayed me,
It opened. It fell. I was hopelessly, completely in love.
It was an electrical storm, a feeling so overwhelming, so vital, that it felt like it could finally silence the ghosts of my past. I loved him, truly, purely, with a reckless abandon only a person starving for affection can possess. The validation came one night, delivered through the cold, glowing screen of a text message, a string of words that lit up my world brighter than any sun. I love you, Ragini. It was the happiest moment of my life, a moment so intoxicating that it blinded me to the subtle warning shifts in the air, the deep, unsettling truth that love, when it comes from a place of profound inner emptiness, is rarely kind. It is often a trap, a brightly colored snare set by predators who sense desperation like blood in the water. The honeymoon period, that brief, dizzying moment of pure connection, lasted only a few short months. Then the gradual, chilling transition began. The conversations changed. The lightness was replaced by a demanding, possessive weight. One night, the text arrived, stark and terrifying. "Show me your body, Ragini." My blood ran cold. The command hit me with the force of a physical blow, snapping me back to the memory of that suffocating bedroom, the metallic sound of a zipper, the forced touch. I refused immediately, a hard, instinctive no bubbling up from the core of my trauma. The rejection was met not with understanding, but with a manipulative, honeyed persistence. He was persuasive, utterly convincing, his words a carefully crafted net. He swore he loved me, swore I was the only one, and then the ultimate lethal promise, the one that broke through my defenses like a battering ram. "I will marry you, Ragini. This is how I know you trust me. This is how I know your love is real." I was young. I was vulnerable. I was starving for the fantasy of a life where I was finally chosen, finally loved, finally enough. The thought of marriage, of permanence, of escaping the constant comparisons and the mother's harsh glare was a beacon of impossible light. I trusted him. I surrendered my fear to his false promise, my judgment warped by my desperate, powerful love. I gave in to his request, sending the image, a silent, desperate prayer that this would seal our bond, that this act would finally make me worthy of the love I craved. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing death. The warmth vanished. The intense late-night chats became shorter, shallower, punctuated by long, anxiety-inducing silences. He started avoiding me. His once eager replies were replaced by one-word answers and days of radio silence. The texts, once filled with declarations of love, now carried the cold, indifferent air of obligation. I asked, I pleaded, I chased the ghost of the connection we had shared, only to be met with increasingly curt dismissal. The final blow was delivered with a brutality that still leaves me breathless, a sudden, final finality that felt like a trap door opening beneath my feet. He blocked me, a simple clinical digital rejection accompanied by a final devastating text before the blackout. "I still love my ex. I can't do this to her." I was shattered. My heart didn't just break, it imploded, leaving behind a black hole of pain and self-loathing. That night, the night I saw the user blocked message, I lay in my bed and felt the ghosts of the past rise up to meet the terror of the present. The forced touch of my cousin, the silent shame of my mother's slaps, the constant drone of Sarika's superiority, all of it culminated in this final, agonizing betrayal. Days later, the truth, always crueler than fiction, surfaced. He hadn't gone back to his ex. He had moved on to another girl. A new connection forged, no doubt, while he was still pretending to mourn with me. That's when the realization hit me with the force of a train wreck. I hadn't been loved. I had been played. My love, my vulnerability, my desperate hope, it had all been a performance for him. a means to an end. I had been used, discarded, and replaced, all because of a fleeting desire he had satisfied before moving on to the next conquest? My mental health, already fragile, collapsed under the weight of that betrayal. The shame was suffocating. I felt dirty, worthless, a complete and utter fool. The scars of the past had become the open wounds of the present, and for a long, terrible time, I didn't know how I would ever breathe again. I retreated further into myself, the world outside becoming a hostile, unbearable place, and the internal echoes of my pain intensified, growing from a whisper to a deafening roar that threatened to consume me whole. The worst part was knowing that I had volunteered the evidence of my own shame, believing it was the price of admission to a love that never existed. This betrayal wasn't just heartbreak. It was a profound, catastrophic failure of trust that would color every relationship I attempted in the years to come. A cold reminder of the consequence of daring to want, of daring to believe, of daring to love when the world had already marked you as a victim. The girl who emerged from that trauma was a fortress built of suspicion and cynicism, but a fortress with a weak, desperate door always ready to be kicked open by the next smooth voice, the next tempting promise of true acceptance. But first, there was college, and another lesson in the brutal, unrelenting nature of human cruelty. The emotional wreckage of the first betrayal became the luggage I carried into my new life, a heavy, unavoidable burden that ensured I would never truly be free, never truly be able to trust my own judgment again. The narrative of my life had been set. Ragini, the girl who was never quite safe, never quite enough, and always, always the victim of her own aching, desperate heart. The quiet echo had found its volume, and it was the sound of a heart breaking for the first time, but far from the last.
After the digital wreckage of my first heartbreak, I managed to drag myself forward, to complete my final year of schooling in a haze of emotional numbness. I focused my shattered energy on the only thing left that felt remotely within my control, a chance at escape. I secured admission into a B.Tech program, a path that promised a professional future, a life away from Soraya Bor, away from the constant toxic comparison with Serica, away from the judging eyes of the village. College was supposed to be a fresh start, a clean slate, a place where the introverted, awkward girl from Kanpur could finally reinvent herself. But trauma doesn't respect geography or new academic environments. It travels with you, an invisible, malignant parasite that feeds on your self-worth. Even in the sprawling, bustling campus filled with thousands of unfamiliar faces, the struggle remained. I still found it almost impossible to make friends. The lessons of my childhood, be quiet, be small, don't trust, you are not enough, or too deeply ingrained. I navigated the lecture halls and the library as a solitary figure, always watching, always on the periphery, convinced that any attempt at connection would only lead to further pain or, worse, mockery. The fear of vulnerability, of being seen and judged, was a shield I couldn't afford to drop. Yet, slowly, cautiously, I did manage to form a few alliances, a small circle of decent, uncomplicated friends who accepted my quiet nature. They were my fragile anchor in the stormy, confusing waters of college life. The turning point, the next act of my private tragedy, arrived in my 3rd year. His name was Farouk. He was everything the first betrayer was not. Confident, articulate, and, crucially, he was the one who approached me. He didn't hover on the edges of my life. He walked right up to me, spoke kindly, and treated me with a gentle deference that I had never experienced from a peer.
He talked to me, not at me. He made me feel noticed, seen, and, perhaps most dangerously, valued. It was a heady, irresistible antidote to years of feeling invisible and worthless. My walls, built with such painstaking effort, began to crack. The heart, that same foolish, hopeful organ, began to beat faster, louder, ignoring the frantic warning sirens of my past. Slowly, inevitably, I fell for him. He became the sole focus of my emotional landscape, a lighthouse in the swirling fog of my academic anxiety and lingering trauma. I told myself this time would be different. This time I was older, wiser, more aware of the signs of manipulation. I was ready to risk it all again, ready to believe in the promise of genuine connection. I decided, in a moment of reckless courage, to bypass the agonizing dance of hints and hopes. I would be direct, honest, and vulnerable. I gathered every last shred of my inner strength and confessed my feelings. The air around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict. The rejection was swift, brutal, and delivered with a casual cruelty that made the world tilt. He didn't offer a polite, gentle excuse. He didn't speak of timing or confusion. He simply said, his voice level, almost bored, he didn't like fat girls. The words, 3 simple, devastating words, didn't just hurt, they were a physical violation. They stripped away the facade of kindness, revealing the cold, shallow judge beneath. The rejection was an agonizing echo of my school days, of the mockery, the comparisons, the constant feeling of being physically, fundamentally flawed. The hope I had dared to nurture withered instantly, leaving behind a blistering shame. I managed to nod, to utter some meaningless, choked-out word, and I walked away, my body numb, my ears ringing with the sound of his dismissive sentence. But the physical humiliation, the blow to my self-esteem, was merely the prelude. A few days later, Farouk approached me again, this time with the proposition that curdled my blood. Could we be friends with benefits? The implied meaning was crystal clear. You are not good enough to be my girlfriend, but you are good enough for my casual needs. The offer was a final, degrading insult, a confirmation that I was seen only as an object, a convenient, discardable pleasure source. I refused, my voice thin but steady, drawing on the last reserves of my dignity. That was supposed to be the end of it. The chapter closed, the lesson learned. I was wrong. Farouk was not a man to accept a gentle no. His vanity had been wounded by my confession, and my refusal to his indecent proposal was an unforgivable offense. What followed was a planned, malicious campaign of destruction.
A few days later, the air on campus changed. The normal background hum of college life was replaced by a low, persistent buzz of whispers. As I walked through the corridors, I noticed the stares, casual at first, then prolonged and piercing. My classmates would suddenly fall silent as I approached, then resume their hushed conversations the moment I passed. The whispers were like a creeping poison, subtle but pervasive. Finally, the whispers coalesced into a direct, brutal confrontation. Classmates, people I barely knew, began to approach me, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and cold judgment, asking the question that brought the entire structure of my self-control crashing down. Did you send nude pictures to Farouk? I was in complete shock. The accusation was a lie, a grotesque inversion of the truth. I hadn't sent him a single photo, inappropriate or otherwise. The memory of the first betrayer's manipulation, the price I had paid for a false promise of love, had been a lesson burned deep into my soul. I was careful now, terrified of repeating that mistake. But the truth was irrelevant.
Farouk had preempted me. He had told everyone, woven a convincing narrative that I had been the aggressor, the desperate, inappropriate girl who had bombarded him with explicit images. No one believed me. My denials were met with skeptical looks, dismissive shrugs, and the undeniable continuation of the shunning. In their eyes, the girl who was fat and desperate was easily the girl who would send nudes. The victim was recast as the villain, and Farouk, the perpetrator of this vicious rumor, walked away with his reputation intact, his cruelty validated by the complicity of the crowd. The shame was overwhelming, a tide of pure, toxic humiliation that threatened to drown me. This wasn't just a college rumor. This was a complete public obliteration of my already fragile sense of self. The emotional wreckage of the past, the secret of my cousin, the digital betrayal of my ex, all rushed forward to meet this new, unbearable reality. I was publicly branded a slut, a liar, a desperate girl who threw herself at a man and then lied about the consequences. The final catastrophic blow was the news reaching home. Even in Soraya Hor, miles away from the campus, the venom of the rumor found its way to my mother. And she, the woman who had physically and emotionally hurt me for minor infractions, the woman who should have been my shield, she believed it too. That belief, my mother's absolute, immediate acceptance of the worst possible narrative about her own daughter, broke me completely. It was the ultimate rejection, the final severance. If the person who gave me life, the person whose love I had spent a lifetime trying and failing to earn, believed I was this vile, desperate thing, then perhaps it was true. I felt lost, utterly worthless, an irreparable mistake. The psychological pain was acute, unbearable, a continuous, screaming agony inside my chest that had no outlet. For the first time, in the cold, dead center of my despair, I considered ending my life. It wasn't a fleeting thought. It was a profound, logical conclusion. If my existence brought only pain, shame, and disappointment to myself and my family, what was the point of enduring? The memory of the trauma, the rumors, the comparisons, it all pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I don't know how, I don't know why, but somehow I survived. A flicker of self-preservation, a tiny, stubborn refusal to let the monsters win kept my feet on the ground. But the survival came at a steep cost. The trauma remained, a deep, festering infection in my soul. My studies suffered catastrophically. The energy needed to engage with the world, to focus, to learn, was entirely consumed by the inner battle. I failed multiple subjects, a final visible sign of the total emotional and psychological collapse I had experienced. I was a failure in every dimension, as a daughter, as a person, and now as a student. The girl who had dreamed of escape was now shackled, weighed down by the debris of her own broken heart and the malicious lies of a spoiled boy. The future, once a promise, now looked like a vast, empty wasteland, and I was forced to walk through it, carrying the heavy, indelible label of shame. The only direction left was forward, but the path was dark, and I walked it entirely alone, listening only to the endless, agonizing echo of my past. The subsequent years were a blur of recovery and retreat. I managed, eventually, to pull my grades back up, to graduate, a limp, uncelebrated completion, not a triumph. But the person who left college was not the same one that had entered. She was hardened, yes, but also deeply scarred. Her capacity for trust brutally mutilated. The lesson from Farouk was the most painful one yet. It's not enough to be good, to be honest, to be quiet. If someone wants to hurt you, they will simply invent a narrative and the world will believe them, especially if you are already perceived as weak. The rumors, the whispers, the constant fear of judgment, they became my permanent companions. I learned to live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning the environment for the next threat, the next potential betrayer. I avoided any emotional entanglement, treating potential partners with a cold, almost clinical distance. I was a ghost, walking through the world, afraid to touch or be touched, convinced that contact would only lead to another burning shame. Yet, as college ended and I entered the strange, indifferent world of adult life, a flicker, a small, stubborn flame of that original, foolish hope refused to be extinguished. The need for connection, for acceptance, for that elusive, life-affirming love was a biological imperative, a craving that transcended logic and self-preservation. It was a terrifying contradiction. I was terrified of vulnerability, but absolutely desperate for intimacy. I knew rationally that the chances of finding true, kind love were vanishingly small, that the universe had marked me for perpetual disappointment. But the heart, my stubborn, resilient, foolish heart, dared to try again. It was an act of masochism, perhaps, or an act of profound, desperate faith. And so I opened myself up, not to a casual flirtation, not to a manipulative promise, but to a feeling so pure, so consuming, that it felt like an echo of the divine. I fell in love with a man who could heal me, or so I hoped. This time, there were no forced pictures, no nasty rumors, no public shame, just the simple, exquisite agony of unrequited affection. The quiet echo of my past had led me to the quiet echo of my future, loving someone with every fiber of my being, only to find that he did not, could not, return that love in the same measure. The story of Ragini, it seemed, was destined to be a symphony of loneliness. The next betrayal wouldn't be an act of malice, but an act of simple, heartbreaking indifference.
The betrayal of Farouk, the public shaming, the gut-wrenching realization that my own mother chose to believe the worst of me, these events didn't just break me, they fundamentally altered my inner architecture. I emerged from college a survivor, yes, but a deeply wounded one, carrying a permanent psychological limp. I secured a job, a small victory of logic over emotion, and started building a life, a quiet, meticulously constructed existence in a new city. I was professionally functional, financially independent, but emotionally walled off, a person who performed life rather than lived it. My apartment was a sanctuary, a quiet, sterile space where the outside world and its inherent cruelty could not reach me. But the most resilient, the most maddening part of the human spirit is its relentless capacity for hope. It's a tiny, stubborn weed that pushes through concrete, even when the concrete is paved with years of shame and betrayal. I was 30 years old, and the ache for real, uncomplicated love, for a partner who saw the woman beneath the scars, was a persistent, gnawing hunger. I craved the comfort of acceptance, the warmth of a hand that wouldn't suddenly turn into a weapon. It was in this period of careful, quiet rebuilding that I met him. I will call him Ian. He wasn't introduced through any dramatic circumstance, no sudden cinematic meeting. He was a colleague, initially just a name on an email chain, a voice in a conference call. Our interactions were professional, polite, and, for me, completely intoxicating. He possessed a rare quality, genuine kindness woven with a quiet intelligence that respected boundaries without making me feel deficient. He talked about philosophy, literature, and the complex, messy realities of life, treating my hesitant, carefully phrased opinions with a seriousness that was a balm to my years of being dismissed as the quiet girl. I didn't fall into this love. I slipped into it, slowly, irrevocably, like a stone sinking into deep water. It wasn't the desperate, needy crush of a lonely teenager. This was a mature, profound appreciation for a man's character, for his soul. I loved him not for what I hoped he could do for me, heal me, save me, validate me, but for who he fundamentally was. My love for Ian was pure, fiercely loyal, and utterly consuming. It was the love I had always been capable of, the love I had always reserved, finally finding a target worthy of its depth. This time, there were no frantic texts, no rash, vulnerable requests, no manipulative promises of marriage. I approached this feeling with a terrifying clarity, a full awareness of the risk. I was 30. I couldn't afford another catastrophe. But the intensity of my affection was too great to hide entirely. He became the sun around which my emotional life revolved. I memorized his mannerisms, the way his eyes would crinkle when he smiled, the subtle shifts in his voice when he was passionately discussing a topic. Every minute spent in his proximity was a minute of pure, distilled happiness. But the story of Ragini is defined by echoes of past hurts, and now the quiet echo of his indifference. He didn't love me back, not in the way I needed, not with the all-consuming passion that was consuming me. His affection for me was genuine, but it was the warm, platonic fondness of a close colleague, a dear friend. He saw my goodness, he respected my mind, he valued my presence, but the deeper magnetic pull, the kind that demands intimacy and commitment, simply wasn't there.
This rejection was a different kind of pain. It wasn't the violent public betrayal of my past, the active cruelty that sought to destroy. This was passive, subtle, agonizingly gentle. It was the pain of absence, of a profound misalignment of souls. It was a truth I had to confront every single day. My love was pure, a torrential river, while his response was a shallow, pleasant stream that flowed in a different direction. I became an expert in internalizing this agony. I learned to read the subtle signals that confirmed my position in his life. The casual touch that was never flirtatious, the late-night call that always centered on a work problem or friend's drama, never on a shared, vulnerable dream. My heart was breaking, not with a sudden, sharp snap, but with a slow, grinding attrition, a constant daily erosion of hope. I would spend hours analyzing his words, searching for a double meaning, a hidden hint of reciprocal feeling, only to crash back down to the cold reality of his unwavering friendship. I dared to talk to him, not confessing my love directly. I was too terrified of driving him away, of losing even the fragile proximity we shared. But speaking of my past, I needed him to understand the landscape of my soul, to see the scars that explained my reserved nature, my occasional profound sadness. I told him about the silence of my childhood, about the deep-seated fear of trust, about the calculated cruelty of the men who had used my desperation. It was a risky exposure, laying bare the decades of shame and trauma. I watched his face as I recounted the cousin, the ex-boyfriend, the vicious rumors started by Farouk, the ultimate pain of my mother's disbelief. He listened, truly listened, with a compassionate stillness that was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. He offered empathy, not pity. He offered a non-judgmental acceptance that was profoundly healing. "Ragini," he said once, his voice soft, "the things that happened to you were horrible, but they don't define who you are. Your worth isn't determined by the cruelty of others." His words were a revelation, a sudden burst of sunlight in the cellar of my self-loathing. He had seen the wounds and hadn't run. He hadn't judged. He had offered a profound intellectual and platonic love that was
in its own way, an unexpected form of salvation. But salvation wasn't the same as romance, and so the torment continued. I was utterly loved by him as a friend, but utterly unwanted by him as a lover. I was in a perpetual state of exquisite agony, close enough to see the paradise I craved, but miles away from ever inhabiting it. This unrequited love became a test. It forced me to confront a deeper truth. Could I love someone purely, without the expectation of return? Could I find my own value, even when the one person I desperately wanted couldn't see me in that light? The love for Ian was pure, undeniably, but it was also suffocating me, preventing me from moving forward, from finding a life where I could be truly, passionately loved back. Every morning, I would wake up with the same dilemma: confess my feelings and risk losing his presence entirely, or remain silent and risk losing my sanity to the daily drip feed of platonic affection that felt like torture. The situation was unsustainable. The daily performance of casual friendship while my internal world was on fire was exhausting. I started withdrawing again, the old patterns of isolation resurfacing. I took longer routes home, avoided the lunchroom, started working late, anything to minimize the moments where my fragile self-control might snap. He noticed, of course. His concern was gentle, observational. "Are you all right, Ragini? You seem distracted." "I'm fine, Ian." I would lie, the word a bitter taste on my tongue. "Just a lot of work." The irony was not lost on me. I had survived sexual trauma, vicious lies, and profound familial rejection. I had rebuilt my life from ashes, and now the final thing that threatened to undo me was the simplest, purest, most beautiful feeling I had ever possessed: a love that had no home. It was the quietest, most subtle form of heartbreak, yet it felt the most devastating because it was self-inflicted, born of a deep, unshakable admiration for a good man who simply did not have the same soul-deep connection to me. I knew the only way forward was to create distance, to force a clean break from the proximity that sustained my foolish hope. But the thought of never seeing him, of truly silencing the beautiful echo he represented, was a terror I couldn't yet face. I was trapped between the terror of loss and the agony of presence. I was a heart that still hoped, but a hope that was slowly, meticulously killing the woman who carried it. I could only hold on to the desperate, perhaps final conviction: my love is pure, and I can only hope that one day he will understand, or that I will understand how to finally let him go. The story of Ragini wasn't over. It was simply stuck in a loop of beautiful, agonizing stasis, waiting for a catalyst, a final turn that would either lead to true healing or to the final, quiet breakdown I had narrowly avoided years ago. The silence had returned, but this time it was the deafening silence of a heart that was loved, but not loved. The stasis became unbearable. I was living a double life: the composed, efficient professional by day, and the woman consumed by a desperate, silent love by night. Ian was the air I breathed, but that air was thin and suffocating. The agony of his platonic love, a love I needed, but not the love I desired, started to manifest physically. I lost weight. Not in a healthy, controlled way, but the kind of gauntness that comes from chronic stress and sleepless nights spent tracing the outlines of a future that would never be mine. My friends, the few good ones I had, began to notice the subtle cracks in my facade. "Ragini, you look exhausted," one of them, Priya, observed one evening, her voice laced with concern as we sat in a quiet corner of a cafe. "Is it work, or is it Ion?" The question hung in the air, a razor-sharp acknowledgement of the elephant in my carefully sealed room. I couldn't lie to Priya. She had been one of the steady constants through my post-college recovery. I averted my gaze, looking out the window at the blurred city lights.
He doesn't feel the same way, Priya, I confessed, the words a raw, painful whisper. He sees me as a dear friend, a confidant, a sister, maybe. I took a shaky breath, the pain welling up, sharp and immediate. I love him, truly, madly. My love is pure, Priya. It's not the needy mess I had before. But his doesn't match the volume of mine. It's like a silent echo, always there, but never answering. Priya reached across the table, her hand resting warmly on mine. Then you have to choose, Ragini. You choose yourself. You either tell him everything and face the final outcome, or you create distance and let the feeling die a natural death. But this in-between, this slow burn is killing you. Her logic was flawless, devastatingly simple. But the fear of the final outcome, the definite loss of his presence, was a paralyzing terror. Losing the idea of him loving me was bearable. Losing the man himself, his laughter, his wisdom, the mere existence in my orbit felt like amputating a part of my soul. I was holding on to a single thread of what if, a desperate belief that if I could just be close enough, long enough, he would eventually see the depth of my commitment and his heart would turn. The tension became a physical illness. I started having vivid, terrifying flashbacks, moments where the current agony would blur with the wounds of the past. I would be sitting in a meeting, and suddenly the fluorescent lights would flicker, replacing the cool corporate office with the dim, quiet bedroom of my childhood. The sound of the zipper cutting through the air, the fear, the forced touch, or I would receive a text from Ion, a perfectly innocent message about a project deadline, and my mind would violently snap to the user-blocked screen, the cold, final dismissal of the first betrayer. The shame Farouk inflicted, the public humiliation, would wash over me in waves, making me feel physically dirty, unworthy of Ion's pure regard. The unrequited love for Ion wasn't just another heartbreak, it was the trigger, the seismic event that brought the entirety of my suppressed trauma to the surface. It was as if my subconscious mind was screaming, "You risked yourself again, Ragini, and you were rejected again. You are perpetually unchosen." The monsters were right. This escalation of my internal distress led to a decision I hadn't expected to make. I needed professional help. The trauma was no longer a ghost. It was a physical presence, dictating my anxiety, my sleeplessness, my inability to eat. I found a therapist, a quiet, astute woman named Dr. Sharma, who specialized in complex trauma and grief. In the sterile, quiet confines of her office, I began, for the first time, to speak the unspeakable. The first session was a torrent of tears and choked out words. I recounted the whole desolate journey, the silent, terrifying afternoons with my cousin, the casual cruelty of my mother's preference for Sarika, the way my father's absence left me vulnerable, the digital violation and immediate dismissal by the first betrayer, the organized, malicious destruction of my reputation by Farouk, and the deepest wound, my mother's willingness to believe the lie over her own daughter. Dr. Sharma listened with the same non-judgmental empathy as Ion, but her compassion came with a framework, a pathway out of the emotional maze. She explained the concept of trauma bonding, the way a person who has been starved of affection can confuse intense, sudden validation with true love, making them susceptible to manipulation. She talked about the way my love for Ion, while pure, had become a safe fixation, a way for my wounded heart to keep itself occupied in a high-stakes, agonizing loop, avoiding the real, terrifying work of self-acceptance. Ragini, she explained gently, you are equating love with pain and rejection. You are unconsciously attracted to the dynamic where you have to fight for acceptance, because that's the blueprint your childhood gave you. Ion's kindness is revolutionary to you, but his platonic nature is familiar. It's the continuation of being loved but not chosen. You are living out your core wound. Her words were like a cold compress on a burn. The most shocking realization was the link between my present agony and my distant past. My cousin, the ex, Farouk, and now the gentle indifference of Ion. They were all, in a twisted way, echoing the original rejection, the feeling of not being enough, not being worth the fight, not being prioritized. The therapy sessions became a relentless excavation of my history. One day, I focused on the cousin. I needed to understand why I still felt the shame was mine. She helped me reframe the memory, emphasizing the power dynamic, the age difference, the absolute lack of fault on my part. But the fear remained. The fear that if I ever told my mother, she would still find a way to blame me. The image of her believing Farouk's lie was the emotional proof. This deep psychological work led to a painful, necessary conclusion. The silence had to end. Not just the silence about my love for Ion, but the decades-long silence about the violation of my childhood. If I couldn't confront the original source of my shame, I would forever be a victim, living in fear of a man who still occasionally walked into my house. The fear of telling my mother was immense, but the fear of remaining broken was greater. The thought of confronting my cousin, a man who still acted with impunity, was terrifying. But Dr. Sharma insisted on breaking the toxic thread of secrecy that bound me to the past. The confrontation with my cousin was a sudden, unplanned moment, born of a wave of righteous anger during one of his casual visits to the family home. He was laughing, telling a light-hearted story, his ease infuriating. I pulled him aside, my voice shaking but firm. I remember, I whispered, my eyes burning into his. I remembered the bedroom. I remember the zipper. I remember you forcing my hand. His face drained instantly of color. The laughter died in his throat. For a sickening moment, the teenage boy who had cornered me was visible beneath the veneer of the respectable man. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply looked at me, a flash of cold, calculating fear in his eyes, and then he left the room, leaving the family gathering, a sudden, unexplained exit that was almost as loud as a confession. The echo of the silence had been broken. It was a small, private victory, but one that shifted the balance of power. The stone of the secret had been dislodged. Now all that remained was the most terrifying step, telling the one person who should have protected me all along, the woman who still chose to believe the worst of her daughter, my mother, Sudha. That conversation, I knew, would be the true test, the final terrifying confrontation with the origins of my life's pain. And if I could survive that, perhaps, just perhaps, I could finally be worthy of a love that was not an echo, but a true reciprocal song. I had survived the malice of men. Now, I had to survive the indifference of family.
The private confrontation with my cousin, that choked whisper of, "I remember," had been the earthquake. The final conversation with my mother, Sudha, was the necessary aftershock, the painful clearing of the debris. I waited until my father, Dinesh, was on one of his rare fleeting visits home, a silent witness I desperately needed, an absent presence I needed to force into reality.
I sat them down in the quiet, stifling drawing room of our family house, the room where Sarika's trophies and accolades shone, the room that had always felt like a tribunal for my failures. My hands were shaking so violently I had to clench them under the table. The air was thick with expectation, the kind of heavy quiet that precedes a storm. I didn't start with the cousin. I started with the end, the most public, most excruciating wound. "Mama," I began, my voice surprisingly steady, though brittle as glass. "Do you remember the rumors in college? About Farouk? About the pictures?" My mother's face hardened immediately. The old, familiar judgment flashed in her eyes. "Ragini, why bring that up again? It was a time of shame. You made a mistake. You must move past it." "A mistake?" I echoed, a terrible, cold clarity descending. "No, Mama, I didn't make a mistake. Farouk lied. He spread a vicious, calculated lie to punish me for rejecting him. He was a bully, Mama, a liar and a monster. And you believed him. You believed a rumor from a stranger over your own daughter." The accusation, so long suppressed, was released, cutting through the silence like a whip. My mother flinched, but my father, who had been watching silently, suddenly leaned forward, his face etched with confusion and a flicker of deep concern. "Suda, what is she talking about?" I didn't let my mother speak. The floodgates were open, and the truth, decades of it, poured out. I told them everything, a raw, unflinching monologue. I told them about the first betrayer, the teenager who used the promise of love and marriage to demand proof of my desperation, and then discarded me. I detailed the terror of the forced touch, the manipulation, the sickening realization that my vulnerability had been weaponized. Then I delivered the final, crushing blow, the one that linked my present shame to my original trauma. "And you believed Farouk's lie because it was easier than believing me. Because deep down, you've always seen me as flawed, as less than Sarika, as someone capable of shame. And that goes back to when I was 8, when I was in the 3rd standard." I paused, my voice dropping to a painful whisper, forcing them to lean in, to feel the gravity of the secret. I looked directly at my mother, then at my father, whose face was now pale and stricken. "My cousin, your nephew, forced me in the bedroom. He made me touch him. He told me he'd hurt me if I ever told anyone. And you came home just in time, Mama. You saved me, and you never even knew. And I never told you because I was more afraid of your anger than I was of him." The room plunged into a profound, suffocating silence. My mother didn't yell. She didn't argue. All the fire, all the sharp, short-tempered energy that had defined her relationship with me seemed to drain out of her. Her face crumpled, the years of unspoken guilt and suppressed maternal instinct rushing to the surface. She stared at me, truly seeing me for the first time in 30 years, not the quiet, disappointing daughter, but the terrified, wounded child. "Ragini," my father finally managed, his voice a broken rasp. He reached for my hand, a gesture of physical comfort I could barely remember from him. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Because I knew you'd prefer Sarika's silence than my shame. And I was right, wasn't I? When Farouk lied, you believed him immediately." My mother finally burst into tears, a deep, rattling, desperate sound that shocked us all. "I didn't know," she choked out, her hands covering her face. I thought I was protecting your father's honor. I thought you were just being difficult." It wasn't a perfect apology. It was clumsy, steeped in her own self-justification, but it was real. In that moment, the silent echo between us, the echo of her unsaid love and my unsaid pain, was broken. The truth, in its rawest form, had finally been accepted.